Well, hello and welcome along to a rather unique edition of Unbelievable on podcast and video, because whereas we normally have two people that I bring together in dialogue, today the only two people on the show are myself and my guest, Richmond Wandera. Now, Richmond has a unique perspective on life, faith and leadership because he was actually raised in a Ugandan slum, but today is the senior pastor of New Life Baptist Church in Kampala and the founder and director of Pastors Discipleship Network. It's a non-profit that serves, equips and trains thousands of pastors across East Africa. So I'm going to be talking to Richmond today about his story, about the theology that he's involved in, the church leadership, issues around Uganda, religion, Christianity and East Africa. And just looking forward to a really interesting conversation on the show today, and especially relevant actually for me, Richmond, because I had a gap year where I spent 6 months in Uganda. This is going back a long time now, but it's so lovely to meet you. And I understand you even have a connection with Unbelievable. You've been listening for a while to the show. Is that the case?
I have been an ardent follower of Unbelievable. It's changed my life. It's changed the leaders in my network because we've been discussing a lot of what you all are discussing on the show. And so thank you so much, Justin, for bringing truth to our world and allowing us to engage. But another thing that you mentioned is you were in Uganda and you specifically spent time in Jinja.
Yes.
So now Jinja, I was born and raised there before moving to Kampala City. And so there is just a warm feeling about you being and loving my country and spending time where I am right now.
That's wonderful. It's great that we've got that connection. I have many friends still in Uganda and a new one in you, Richmond, which is wonderful. And I hope to come back at some point and visit again. It's been a long time since my wife and I were in Uganda. Tell me a little bit about, first of all, your role there as a church leader in Uganda. Tell me about New Life Baptist Church and the kind of community that you're serving in Kampala.
New Life Baptist Church is set in Chireka community. And it's the kind of community that was regarded by many as a forgotten community. If you put a pin at New Life Baptist Church and put a circle 1.5 mile radius around the church, Justin, you'd have circled over 200 brothels.
Wow.
We're right in the heart of it. We are a highly Muslim community with a lot of children who are not in school. Poverty has hit this community like no other in the country. And when we were thinking of a place to plant the church, one of the words that guided us was the darkest place. And so we ended up planting a church in Chireka. And so I'm really honored to see all the transformation that the church has led and championed in this community, not just in terms of people coming to Christ and finding truth and hope in the gospel, but the change that's happening in the community as a result of the other things that we do under the theme of justice for the community. So that's really a summary of where we're right in the heart of darkness in Uganda. My heart for Pastors Discipleship Network, though, is a heart for equipping leaders. I have a PhD in philosophy of leadership, and in Africa, leadership is one of the biggest gaps, and it's led to a lot of pain and suffering and a lot of disorder. And my hope is to bring the leadership skills and knowledge and everything that I have got from my time paying attention to research and reading and critiquing, and then bringing that to those who are working with me to make a difference in Uganda. But a big heart of mine is in the theology side. Obviously, I'm very driven by what Christ said, that the blind man cannot lead a blind man, because if that happens, they will both fall in a ditch. And my heart and love for my people in Uganda wants to protect them from this ditch.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Uganda itself before we come to speaking of particularly some of the social, cultural, theological sort of issues that exist there. Now, when I was there 20 plus years ago now, President Museveni was in power. I understand he is still in power today, and obviously there have been issues just recently around elections. It's been in our newsfeed as well that there's been some unrest in Uganda recently. Do you want to just update us on what the situation is at present out there, Richmond?
It's a very tough time we're living in right now. We just had the presidential elections about a week ago. And in order to shield Uganda from scrutiny in the West, internet was shut down, social media was shut down, news couldn't leave this country to go out. And so that's the first phase of change, unprecedented change like we have never seen. And then beyond that, after the pronouncing of the current president as president again since 1986, we have seen a lot of chaos that ensued following that. Now, obviously, there's been a strong presence of the military and the police in the streets to try to curtail any other response. But it's been a tough season. Anyone in business is struggling, especially business that has to do with online. Anyone who is pursuing work or tasks at any company that basis on email or the internet is basically crashing. It's a very hard time.
Yeah.
Just in.
And I imagine this comes obviously in the wake of COVID, which has impacted Uganda just as much as any other country. What has been the effect of the COVID pandemic there?
Well, Uganda has been hit probably the most in the whole of East and Central Africa. I think about the first statistic that our economists have just put up. There's a very clear statement that it's going to take another 15 years for the Uganda's economy to recover to the point that it was before COVID. And even then, that point was not good. The unemployment rate as a result of companies shutting down is unbelievable. The people that have gone through hunger and pushed beyond hunger into starvation and some death has been a number that's unbelievable. Part of the thing that I was championing during this COVID was providing food for the poorest of the poor. And I joined ministries like Compassion and others to make sure that we don't lose that many people during this COVID time. So when you think about the poor and those that have been affected, the category that comes out the most is the children, obviously. As they were locked down under the lockdown that the entire country experienced, many of them stayed home in houses where there was no food, there was no provision, there was no work. And so the children were affected the most. And then the mothers, especially the single mothers who had no other partner to bring in any support. And so it's been a very, very tough year, and it continues to be tough for us in the country.
I mean, you mentioned Compassion there, and I should say that today's show is very much being brought in partnership with Compassion, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and the amazing work and your own story and how it connects with Compassion as a child sponsor. But I mean, the COVID situation has, in a sense, affects different parts of the world very differently, given the different economic situations that exist. And I've got friends in Uganda who've been hit super hard by COVID. So I'm aware of just the huge hardship that involves. But I do want to spend a little time talking about, the history a little bit of Christianity in Uganda and East Africa. I mean, many people, I think, are unaware of the way in which Christianity, especially a kind of Pentecostal form maybe of Christianity, really swept East Africa in the latter part of the 20th century. I mean, they call it the East African Revival. Huge numbers of people becoming Christians, but probably in the West, we're not actually that familiar with the way Christianity has just exploded really across the African continent in those kinds of ways. Do you want to just give us a sense of kind of what that's looked like in the recent decades in Uganda specifically, but across the East African continent?
Yes. So Uganda was colonized by Britain, and only in 1962 did we as a nation receive our independence. And During this period of colonization, it followed naturally that religion was part of the narrative. And so a lot of people in Uganda became Christians and began to learn about this new religion called Christianity. And so in 1962, when Uganda got its independence, even the king himself associated with Christianity. And that continued to 1971, when Idi Amin became president. Now, Idi Amin was a Muslim, and he had one main agenda: to turn Uganda into a Muslim nation. And so their persecution began, and so many people lost their lives. Many Christians fled. I know personally pastors who fled in 1973 and left the country fleeing for their lives. We had very grotesque cases of people being forced to eat whatever they were wearing on their feet if they were found preaching the gospel. The kind of gruesome persecution that led to a lot of people fleeing. But in 1979, when Idi Amin was overthrown or fled the country, we began to see a freedom return to the church. And in that wake is when people began to pray and to repent and to come before God saying, heal our land. And it was in the midst of prayer that many people began to seek Christianity, or at least the consideration of Christianity, as a priority. They had tested another religion and they have tested what that could do. And so now they were looking for an alternative. And so people began to run towards Christianity to understand it for themselves. You know, for the most part, the literature around Uganda will communicate Christianity as a religion that someone was born in. And so without necessarily engaging personally and understanding God for themselves, they associated with Christianity. They would call themselves Christians without knowing what Christianity really is. And so at this point, though, people began to seek God for themselves. In fact, in my morning devotion yesterday, I was reading Job's words when he said, my ears had heard about you, but now my eyes have seen you. The idea that I knew only about you, I had the knowledge of you from someone else, but now it's a personal religion. And I think that's where that's what gave birth to the East African revival. People began to pursue God for themselves. And so what really happened was that from this wake, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and Burundi began to awaken to a personal experience or a personal journey with God, which was quote unquote called Christianity. And so that continued up until the late 80s, where there was a war that was coming in. The current president was coming in 1986. And already what the waves that had been started by this revival, so to speak, began to be curtailed by some of the war that was going on, which is probably the worst of the wars our nation has seen. And it's normally dubbed the Luwero Triangle War, where two rebel groups were pressing against the government at the same time. And that, along with many other things, began to slow down the fire, so to speak, of this revival. But then these many Christians that had received God and had a personal experience with God began to raise a generation of people that would call on the name of the Lord, those who would subscribe to Christianity. And remember that in the background, there's a lot of wars that are going on. And so a lot of fathers were falling. In fact, my dad was killed within this same period. And so a lot of people became fatherless and homeless. So many orphans began to emerge. And about this time, many people still associated with the Christian faith, but then they didn't have people to teach them how to live, to teach them the Christian walk. And so the Christianity kept on spreading. And so about 15 years, for the first time, we began to see an awakening of the need to train pastors. People began to recognize the place of training, the place of theology, the place of understanding, the place of grasping meaning, and asking tough questions about the Christian faith for themselves, so that the new generation of Christians can be grounded. And so we are, I think, still living in that time when there's a generation, which I would say like my generation, that grew up without fathers, or a fatherless generation, that at the back of our minds associated to the Christian faith, but yet now there was questions that forced new dialogue that had to be answered. And I think that we are at a very good place, Justin. In 1971, between 1971 and 1979, the number of Christianity, or the percentage of Christians, came down to as low as 15% of the entire nation's population. Well, right now, if you put denominations together and without kind of cutting those denomination lines, Uganda is 84% a Christian nation.
Wow.
There's been an awakening. There's been an opportunity that has been given to this generation like never before. And so we are seeing a need and a hunger of this new generation to understand for themselves what it means to be Christian. But the environment is very enabling for the Christian church.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear the background to it and the history that's brought you to this place. I mean, obviously, even when Christianity becomes very widespread, it doesn't mean that all the social ills of a country disappear overnight. And of course, one of the issues I noticed when I was in Uganda, you know, as I say, going back 20 years now, and I don't know how different the situation may be today, but was that there was a pressing need for theological education, that the church was growing fast, but when the church grows fast, very often the theological underpinnings don't grow with it. And when I went out into, you know, more rural areas, especially, I would find a lot of a kind of blend, really, I suppose, of folk religion, maybe former kind of things that were more associated with witchcraft and curses and things being kind of put together with Orthodox Christianity. How much is that an issue now, would you say? What kind of is needed in Uganda to kind of help the Christian church grow in a good direction?
Justin, that continues to be a problem. The blend of African folk religion and African traditional religion with Christianity continues to be a massive problem. I'll give you two examples. The first one is how fast or how quickly pastors are changing their names to mirror almost witchcraft. So a little bit of a background here. In Uganda, most witch doctors will not use their given names for their practice or for their job. They would use more scary names. For example, the man who sits on a lion, or the man who would swallow pins without being hurt, or the man who sends back curses. And so those would be the names, Mbizayo, Ntula Kungo. Those are very scary names. And so it kind of tells the people that if you have a problem, maybe it's a woman who's struggling to have children, or there's a person who has a problem with their neighbor, you go to such a person. And if there's been witchcraft done against you or a curse, that person will send it back and set you free. Well, think about that kind of thinking and then see what's happening in the church today. Most pastors, I mean, next to us is a pastor who's changed his name to Mbizayo. I send whatever is against you back to where it came from. So if it's witchcraft, come to me, the witchcraft is back. And so on Bizayo, there is another pastor who calls himself the one who gives prosperity. And there's a coined word, a local word for that. And you wouldn't even know his given name or his surname. You wouldn't even know that. But that's just infiltrating the church. And pastors cannot divorce themselves from this African folk religion. And that's what I seek to try to explain, that this blend that is coming in seems to be in some cases branded as African versions of Christianity, but it surely has some taints that are very dangerous for the new believers who are trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions I want to ask at this point. I suppose one thing that is immediately apparent, if you like, is that the kind of environment that you are doing your Christian witness in and theology and everything is quite different to the average Western environment, where it's a very secular outlook here, and the idea of curses and demons and witchcraft, it all sounds like something in a Harry Potter novel, not something we encounter in real life. But in Uganda, there is a more of a kind of, in that sense, supernaturalism dimension to people's everyday kind of thinking and reality, right? So in that sense, would you say the kind of issues that you're having to speak into and deal with are in a sense more directly issues around, the way people engage the supernatural and that kind of thing, not so much trying to persuade people to believe in God in the first place? It's kind of bringing people to a correct understanding of God rather than a kind of, some issue of, I just need to appease the demons or make sure the spirits are kind of serving me or whatever it is.
Yeah, I would say that, Justin, that actually many people in Uganda would laugh at the West, because the Western narrative that has been communicated to the people in Uganda is that Satan doesn't exist, God doesn't exist, demons are not at work, there are no blessings, there are no curses, that doesn't exist. Well, in Uganda, it's almost part of our culture, part of the way we live. Typically, if a person will succeed in business, no one will say that person succeeds in business because they work hard. No, the reason that would be attributed to that would be when this person was a child, the mother washed this child with the right herbs, spoke the right words over this child, and lo and behold, see what the child has become. And so then there is the side of science. For the most part, the West is very science-driven, very evidence-based. While in Uganda, people's life experience has been shown to portray almost a different life experience from the West. Now, it's a mystery. I don't know that anybody could say they fully understand it. But Justin, I'm speaking to you right now, and I have seen things. Okay, I have a master's degree. I have a PhD in philosophy of leadership. I have read a lot of books that would argue that there is no such thing as spirituality. Well, I have seen things which there is not a laboratory or something that could explain what I have seen. And so it's first of all misleading if someone says that the people that believe in witchcraft, the people that believe in blessings and curses are not educated. No, I would say that many of the people who are actually engaged in a lot of this practice are educated. They've been exposed to science, they've been exposed to labs, but they have a life experience that cannot be denied. And so what my role and what many of the past roles I see is can we drive a wedge between this blend of folk religion and African traditionalism and Christianity, because that is dangerous. And how do we sort through that carefully without throwing out the baby with the bathwater? How can we do that? It's a difficult and very challenging task.
Yeah. And in a sense, I could imagine there are equally those who say, but Richmond, you shouldn't, just embrace this Western view of Christianity and lose the kind of your African background. There is even, I've spoken to Black Christians here in the UK who are kind of thrown over Christianity because they say we were given a kind of white man's version of Christianity, which divorced it from my African roots, and they're going back to something that's maybe like a Black Hebrew Israelite kind of view, or the kind of Black consciousness movement, and saying we need to re-embrace kind of the folk religion that kind of that is of my ancestors, rather than this kind of thing that got imported, colonially as Christianity. So how do you navigate that balance? Because you don't want to just be another kind of version of a kind of Western white Christian, but also there's evidently Christ has made a huge difference to the way you now understand God, spirituality, and the spiritual atmosphere you find yourself in Uganda, Richmond?
Absolutely, Justin. There were some errors made by the early missionaries, and sadly, we are still paying the price for some of those errors that were made. When the early missionaries came, their statement was clear to those who would follow Christianity, that your drums are evil, your music instruments are evil. When you come in here, you use these hymn books, you stand in this way. Forget rhythm, forget dancing, forget praise, forget those celebrations. When you come, this is exactly how you do it. Let the whole earth be silent, for God is in his holy temple. There is this idea that came in with the early missionaries, and anyone who followed the missionaries for whatever reason, whether it's the benefits that came by closely associating with missionaries or genuine believers who took on this faith, there was this new adaptation to Western practice. And the drums were kicked out of the church. The instruments and our style and our rhythm and our dance was all kicked out of the church. Well, until the last 30 years, that has always been the flaw. But there's been questioning, some rigorous questioning that has been going on over the last 30 years. People saying, what of what was introduced to us was true biblical Christianity and what was simply Western practice or Western portrayal of Christianity. And that is the conversation that has led to where we are right now, where people are saying that, is the African drum truly evil? What makes something evil? Can an instrument in itself be evil? And all these things began to be the conversation that people began to engage with. And then that's when the list of mistakes that were made by previous missionaries that were good people, but they made these mistakes innocently. And so we began to see that there is a list that's developing on what mistakes were made. And then the list of that which we must do now to correct those kinds of mistakes. Now, obviously, as any discussion, as any dialogue would go, some people will swing all the way to the right and some all the way to the left. And there is an error. But for me, I think striking a middle balance and being objective about this and not just reacting to colonial rule and colonial introductions to colonial practice, rather than just reacting mindlessly, I think it's really important to strike.
Yeah. I liked the way one former hippie put it, who was kind of converted in the kind of Jesus People revolution in America. And he said, some people said I wasn't able to do my rock music anymore because I'd become a Christian. And he said, but when I got baptized, my guitar got baptized with me. So maybe it's a similar situation. God obviously does use everyone's ethnic background and cultural background, but it becomes redeemed. It becomes, used in his service ultimately. But just to stick with this issue, I suppose, of the way obviously the West has been originally in colonial terms impacted the way people then took on Christianity. Even today, I think there are some people who see a negative influence, particularly from the prosperity gospel movement, maybe that has developed, especially in parts of the US, and which have been embraced almost wholesale and maybe even gone even further in parts of Africa. I mean, do you encounter that a lot in Uganda, and how do you respond to it yourself?
Well, I'll say to you that some of the most dangerous or most lethal messages that have come from the West to the African space has been the prosperity gospel or the health and wealth movement or the name it and claim it movement, which started in the late 70s and maybe even in the 80s. And televangelists took this on and began to drum this. I think for the most part, Africa was still trying to wrestle with the question, what is African Christianity? And does that really exist? And we're trying to formulate an African Christian experience and to clearly understand it. But in the midst of all of this is when we got this messaging that came through very strongly through our televisions. I can say to you that when I first started watching Christian television, which was in my late teenage years, finally access to a TV, I can say that majority of the hours on our Christian television was by very wealthy American televangelists that were broadcasting a single message. For example, some of the messages I clearly remember to this day is, hey, there's this one handkerchief. If you buy it, your problems are sorted. Oh, I just had a word from God. And if you also $7 or $77 or $777 or $7,000, you would receive in the next 7 days, 7 times over the thing you. I mean, that's messaging to this very. I could just recite it because that's exactly what we are. And people, I mean, the poorest of the poor got their $7, put that in the mail, and sent it to these ministries. And that just crashed us because at the end of the day, when someone has heard from God through the man of God and sowed in faith, and time after time, it's turning out different from what the evangelist promised it would be. Man, it crashes faith. It crashes understanding and conviction in Christianity as a true religion. And so it gives birth to what we are experiencing right now, which is a people who would say they are Christians, but they're not really Christians. And so we are wrestling with that right now because, Justin, here's the thing. The prosperity gospel is attractive. It's so attractive. It's dangerously attractive. It's the kind that I would categorize as that which people's itching ears want to hear. When you think about a person in poverty, what message do you think a person in deep poverty is eager and longing to hear? And it's a message of hope no matter what is contained in it. Even if it's false hope and it takes them through a day or two, there's sometimes they become happy with that. And then they begin to realize that what's making me happy and soothing my difficult situation may not necessarily be true, because over the last period of times I have tested it, it's proved false, but it's appealing and it's good. And guess what? When that became available in our environment, most pastors, even the true pastors, began to realize that that's what people wanted to hear. And they abandoned truth and took on this prosperity gospel. And it's swept through. If you look at the numbers, the rate at which the prosperity gospel is growing and increasing is heartbreaking. You wouldn't believe it's faster than wildfire. And to even try to curtail it. Now, just in some of what I am doing is helping pastors return to truth. But some of the biggest criticism I have received, some of the biggest attacks I have received has been from the people that have made it, the pastors that have made it through this prosperity gospel. And they're saying, you're cutting off our water supply. And so, Justin, we find ourselves in a very hard place. But we're fighting.
Yeah, I would say the question then is, how do you respond to poverty? Because, as you said, the reason the prosperity gospel is so attractive is because it offers an easy answer. You know, if you just do this, say this prayer, give this amount of money, then, you know, all your problems go away. And obviously that is not the gospel. But it's very easy for me as a Western person in a very comfortable situation to say, isn't it terrible? But the reality is poverty is crippling, and you can fully understand why that message becomes so attractive in a particular environment. How do you then, in your church, Richmond, and obviously through the Pastors Discipleship Network across East Africa, how do you respond in a biblical way to poverty, and what are you seeing happen?
You know, I'll just share what recently happened during this COVID time. Some things are happening in Africa, Justin, that I think the world would do well to pay attention to and even possibly learn from. People are more generous than we think. People have potential for good, sacrificial kind of good that would blow your mind away. During this COVID period, we mobilized the church and talked about how the church is to respond in times of crisis and in times of suffering. And we saw two things happen. people who had very little to live on were able to share the little they had with the church so that the church could bring that food to communities and to people that needed it the most. I mean, the poor person giving from the little they have to someone else who is in great need. And Justin, you were here about 20 years ago. You might have experienced something like this. And most people who are connected to children in Africa, maybe as their sponsors or by someone else, would see this a lot. That when they visit, this poor family would get their only chicken and give it to this person to say thank you. And oftentimes I've seen people rejecting it, saying, hey, that's all you have. I need to be giving you another chicken. That people say, no, I'll share with you the little that I have. And so what I saw, Justin, was just humbling and inspiring to see how the poor were able to pull together resources and help fellow poor people. The second thing I saw, Justin, is something that I started with New Life Baptist Church, but other churches caught onto it very fast. And we called it temporary adoption. And temporary adoption was simply an offer by families within the church who could feed one extra child, offering to families who knew if the children stayed in their homes, they would die. And these children, essentially, for as long as these other families could keep them, exchanging and giving these children on to these families. And obviously we were supervising that and making sure that it was done properly. But it was amazing to see the people. I mean, I'll share Pastor Peter, who is my pastor, growing up as a child in a child development program. Pastor Peter, he has 4 children of his own. He's already adopted 3 children, received 3 additional children. Remember, he was at a point where financially things are not good at all, but he couldn't stand on the sidelines and see a child dry out, stand alone in the cold and hungry. And so we began to see the church give so generously in ways that's amazing. And it's almost a writing on the wall to anyone who is very individualistic, someone who feels I have to take care of me first, my insurance, my this, my that, and then I'll take care of someone else. It's almost a writing on the wall for that person to read and say, look, life is more meaningful and it's more beautiful when we live not just for ourselves, but we see other people as well. So that's the first thing that I have seen, in which poverty, in a way, poverty is addressed by awakening the church to the power of love, the power of practical love and active giving. The second thing I have seen is how parachurch organizations or ministries that work through the local church are able to reach out to people who are generous, who are not necessarily in communities that are struggling the way other communities are, and saying to them, look, you can support financially, and through the local church, we can make this help available. And I think that's what we have seen. Obviously, that's my experience. It was a parachurch organization that's whose mission was to try to release children from poverty in Jesus' name, that connected me to a 15-year-old girl who committed to sponsor me through my years of suffering. And I am here today. And I think that kind of working through the local church caused the local church to shine, was, I think, another very effective way of releasing people from poverty. I mean, look at me. I've been totally released from poverty at every sense of the word. And that has been through God's work through parachurch organizations that partner with the local church that is in these broken communities to make a difference. And so awakening the local people to look at what is in their hands and how can they use that. And then to go on from there to say, how can the universal church participate in attacking this monster called poverty?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to come in a moment to talking about specifically Compassion, who is the parachurch organization you're referencing there, and the way that they have helped to lift so many communities out of poverty by this extraordinary child sponsorship program that they run. But before we get to that, just tell me a little bit of that background of yourself. I mean, what was the conditions that you grew up in yourself, Richmond, and just tell me that story of what happened when you received this extraordinary sponsorship and what that difference that made, I suppose, in terms of where you are now.
Yeah. So, Justin, when I was 8, what I feared the most happened to me. My father was killed, and that just shattered our home. I was the third born of 6 children, and my mother was uneducated. We ended up leaving our home and landing in Uganda's worst slum at the time, called Naguru. By the time I was 9 years old, I had dropped out of school. My mother was bedridden because of sickness, and I was on the street. By the time I was 10 years old, I had already suffered from malaria 10 times, coming to near-death situations. But everything changed when Compassion International intervened and connected me to a 15-year-old girl called Heather, who sponsored me. And her sponsorship did so much. I was able to go back to school. I was able to find food daily. I was able to be treated whenever I felt sick, and literally brought into a community and into a space where local African God-fearing people who feel called to serve children were present for us, and they protected me. And that's where a lot of healing happened in my life. By the time I was 14, I made a decision to follow Christ. By the time I was 17, I had seen all 4 of my siblings, except 2, make a decision to follow Christ. Just when I was 19, I witnessed my mother make a decision to follow Christ. At the age of 22, I was invited to become the associate pastor at the very church that I was plugged in as a compassion child. Today, I have the absolute honor of being the senior pastor of this church. And I'm just so honored to be given this.
It's an amazing story, and what I love about this is that, I mean, obviously every time anyone sponsors a child, they're sponsoring the future of that child, really, and that future will impact so many more people. So in your case, it's been about church ministry, leadership, that's community leadership as well, but also, you know, receiving an amazing theological education. I mean, you as you say, you have a degree, a PhD, and that is something I think people often forget, is that also makes a huge difference, because the church needs educated leaders. It needs people who understand theology, who are able to make a real difference in these places where Christianity is growing so quickly, as we said, but also needs direction and needs that you know, firm kind of leadership and good theology behind it as well, doesn't it?
First, I agree 100%, because my mind fixes on the word potential. Justin, if you met me as an 8-year-old on the street, the way I was dressed, the way I looked, what I was eating, how I was, you would never see a leader. You'd never see an accountant. You'd never see a pastor. It leads me to conclude that potential is everywhere, but opportunity isn't. So the more people can choose to live simply so that others can simply live, to live with less so that others can live with more, choosing a life, I mean, it's a voluntary choice, like, look, I will enter this space and release this child's potential. The more that can happen, the more we begin to see what's happening right now. The first thing is the ripple effects. So as a child who was growing out of poverty and now released from poverty, I am pastoring and teaching my community truth. But Justin, before I became a pastor, I was an accountant. I taught accounting at Uganda Christian University and in Makerere University Business School. I taught accounting, and for 5 years, my mission was one, to heal my corrupt country by developing ethical accountants. And for 5 years, I drummed that drum loud. And so many young accountants, and who are now very, very experienced professional accountants, are in good positions that are making a difference where they are. And so it's potential, but it's also a decision people have to make, to choose to live with less, to live simply. And I think people don't realize the power of one act, one decision, and how that can literally change the world. And so, again, the other thing I would say, looking back, is that 20 years ago, this child who was helped, Heather did not think of me as an inheritance for my nation. So what Heather has done voluntarily or involuntarily, knowing or unknowing, is she's given Uganda, my nation, an inheritance of a fully formed leader, one who fears the Lord, one who will work ethically, and who will spend their life making a difference. That's an inheritance that Heather has given to our nation. And I'm working as hard as possible to generate the next group of emerging leaders and handing them forward as an inheritance. I think about the millions of people who are touched by Heather's single decision and how those now form an inheritance to the nation of Uganda, and how powerful one act is when someone has the courage to put their foot down and say, look, you know what, Skip, I'm just going to go in and I'm going to fight. I'm going to join this fight.
Richmond, it's been so good to talk to you. Thank you so much for being with me on the program today. Your story is so powerful, and you've obviously said how different your life would be if you hadn't had a compassion sponsor. Now, if you're listening to the podcast or watching the video right now, we're doing something kind of unique in today's episode. We've decided to partner with Compassion International to find more sponsors for children who were very much like Richmond in the same situation. And we've got this partnership with Compassion for today's episode because we trust the way they work. When you invest in the life of a child every month, you can be sure that 80% of that is being spent specifically for the development of that little boy or girl that you sponsor. Compassion doesn't give money directly to children because they know that just handing out money isn't going to make a long-term impact. But spending that money wisely for nutrition and healthcare and education, teaching boys and girls to grow up and escape poverty, well, that does make a huge difference. And as we've heard from Richmond, Compassion does it all through local churches around the world. So we've got a bit of a goal today on today's episode of finding new sponsors. We'd love to sponsor at least 100 children with today's episode in 2021. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? It's like kind of like sponsoring a large village almost of children. And we'll make it really simple for you. You've got two options, okay? The first is that right now, even as you're listening or watching, you can literally open up a text on your phone and send my name, Justin, to 83393. That's Justin to 83393. Now that'll only work if you live in the US, I should say. And if you do that, you're going to get a text back with a picture of a child and a link. You just click that link, follow the steps to start sponsoring. It's really, really easy. So again, that's a text to 83393 and just send my name, Justin, on it. Okay. Now the second option is also very easy, and it's going to work from the US or anywhere in the world. So if you go to compassion.com/Justin, okay, again, compassion.com/Justin, you can choose exactly which boy or girl you want to sponsor. So we're trying to make this really easy for you. We've worked with Compassion, so you'll also get a free gift, actually, if you're in the US when you start sponsoring. That's the Unbelievable book. That's my story of the show and my faith, and why I'm still a Christian after 10 years of talking with atheists. Again, that's only unfortunately just for logistics available in the US if you can sponsor, but we will send you a copy of Unbelievable as a thank you. And if you've already got a copy of the book, maybe it'll make a great gift for someone else. And again, as Richmond has said, one of the reasons we've decided this is so important right now is because of that COVID-19 situation, which we know is having a devastating effect all over the world. But we know how much it's radically changed our lives in the UK, the US, but countries like Uganda, where many people live in deep poverty, we're seeing thousands more children being forced to the point of starvation. Families can't work. I have friends in Uganda, and I have seen and heard, and they've sent me videos of what's happening. So anything you can do makes a huge difference, because jobs are on the line, schools are closed. The World Health Organization saying COVID is setting international poverty development efforts back at least 10 years. So we feel strongly about this. So if you're able to make a difference, again, we would love to see as many children sponsored as possible through Compassion. Again, in the US, you can text 83393 and make sure to put Justin on the text. And you'll get a link to follow and start sponsoring. And you'll also be sent a free copy of the book as well. Or from the US or anywhere else, you can go to the website, compassion.com/Justin, and choose a boy or girl to sponsor from, as many as 25 different countries. But it's been so good to catch up with you, Richmond. One question I've got just before we close out is, in a sense, hearing how different our contexts are, the reality is that most of the time, my Unbelievable show, we're often speaking into a Western context where there is a kind of, obviously, that the secular Christian divide is perhaps much greater than it has been in Uganda and East Africa. So why have you been a listener in Uganda? And you even told me before we started recording that you spent a whole month discussing the Jordan Peterson and Susan Blackmore edition of our big conversation. So what's that all about? Tell me why you've found this a helpful resource even in your different situation.
First of all, thank you, Justin, for the Unbelievable show. It's a podcast. It's just literally changing our lives, and this is why. Uganda for a long time has been branded, as many African countries have been, as a part of the dark continent where there's, folk religion, tradition, witchcraft, and almost like backward thinking. Well, that's changing and changing quickly. We are experiencing an invasion of secularism, postmodern thought, and many of these other schools of thought that previously we are not even on the surface, not even on the radar for us to engage with. Now, when the younger generation is beginning to ask questions, two fears are hitting our minds, and especially the minds of pastors. One, we are not educated, generally speaking, as pastors. The average pastor would have finished what we would call senior 3, so the kind of class that you'd be in if you were 14 or 15 years old. And so most pastors would have dropped out of school at that level. The current generation has now moved light years ahead of that. And so the level of education of the average population has gone up significantly beyond where most pastors would be. So that's already creating this fear in pastors of irrelevance. And then that's the first thing. The second thing is the fact that many pastors, live alone mainline education, are not theologically trained. Even those that might have their first degree don't have theological training. And yet the questions that this emerging generation is asking are questions they're drawing from the internet, very difficult, complex, apologetic type questions. And the pastors are using all kinds of tactics, saying, hey, don't go to the internet, that you're hanging out with the wrong friends. Who taught you to ask those questions? And they're trying to be tough. But within the pastors, there's a fear that's kind of sweeping over the land. And so we said, look, rather than hiding and shying away from these tough conversations, let's engage them. Because what else are we going to do? And so that's when I began on the journey of trying to find out who is actually engaging these talks in a balanced way. And I landed on Unbelievable. And so your discussions, especially, I mean, I can mention many here, but the one I mentioned to you earlier on, Jordan Peterson and Susan Blackmore, we were able to draw that out and kind of peel back the curtain and see what's going on in the minds of these two individuals. And then how does this separate itself from our current position? I could go in detail on how we went around it, but I can say to you that month brought a lot of clarity and a lot of help to many of these very untrained pastors that are hungry and thirsty for training, hence what I do with Pastors Discipleship Network.
Well, it's just such a joy to know that the show is reaching and making a difference. It was the last thing I expected, if I'm honest. But I hope to be able to return myself to Uganda, where there's still a piece of my heart in Uganda, and so I would love to return and spend time there with friends, make new friends as well, and maybe even have some conversations for the show out there as well. But it's been so good. Thank you very much for joining me on the show today, Richmond.
Thank you, Justin.
And just a reminder that if you would like to sponsor a child through Compassion, we would love to see 100 children sponsored if possible through Compassion today from today's show. In the US, you can text 83393 and just put the name Justin on your text. So text Justin to 83393. You'll get a link to follow and start sponsoring. Or from the US or anywhere else, you can go to compassion.com/Justin and choose a boy or girl to sponsor from many different countries. But if you are in the US, and I'm afraid just because of logistics wise, it's only to folk in the US who are sponsoring. If you do sponsor though, through either of those links, you'll get a free copy of my book, Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. So thanks for watching today. Richmond, thanks for being with me, and all the best, and God bless you as you continue in your ministry in Uganda.
Well, thank you so much, Justin, and look forward to hosting you back home here.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.